Good morning everyone, it's another week of drawing requests and let's see whose prompt we're picking this week. And the winner is Arty Lauren, and she suggested a jellyfish, a rhinoceros and an ostrich having a party in a sunflower field. I've actually been quite looking forward to this one. I'm going to put a link up to her channel as well on the page somewhere, somehow. I want to try and start this up a little bit more again. I did mention it more at the beginning, but I kind of want to bring that back. So sorry to people who haven't done this too yet, but this is what I'm going to try and do going forward. And the art movement this week is arts and crafts. It feels like these are random at times. I did mention arts and crafts briefly last week, as it could be described as the precursor to Art Nouveau. Now it's this week's style, so we're going full circle. It was also an international art style, but this one started in the UK rather than across lots of different areas of Europe around the same time. It also focused on the decorative arts like Art Nouveau, but this time it was focused on craftsmanship of really simple forms inspired mostly by folk art and medieval art. It really was a reaction from the end of the Industrial Revolution in the UK and really an anti-industrialisation mood at the time. It became this identifier of to love the handmade item and the quality piece of work over the mass-produced industrial item of the same type, which I really think has kind of again come full circle more recently when you look at things like Etsy and all of these more smaller sellers online who are creating very specific, unique pieces of work. I think you can say that we've gone through this again of, instead of this time it being the focus on industrialisation, which we're all already used to, I think there has again been a thought on, well, when it's a mass-produced item, it's of a lower quality or it's not as special, and people are more willing again to say, I would rather spend a little bit more on something unique and handmade and I know that's a quality product than something mass-produced. And in both cases, as we're going to look at a little bit more in arts and crafts as I talk about it now, it's hard to separate it from the socialist movement. Now, the key people who really founded arts and crafts as an idea and an art style were John Ruskin, who was a writer, but he did lots of stuff in loads of different subjects, so it's a little bit hard to describe him too closely, but he was predominantly a writer and very focused on the links between art and nature. You could say he was the beginner of a lot of ideas on sustainability that we have now. And William Morris, who was an architect turned artist, again from the UK, who ended up founding a decorative arts company where he designed and made interior decorations such as wallpapers and fabrics and furniture and stained glass windows again. And he did loads of writing and political work just like Ruskin too, and he was the propagator really of the early socialist movement in the UK. And like I say, the two are very closely defined because arts and crafts was predominantly concerned with the quality of products and saw industrialisation as the root of lower quality products that were overly ornate and just not fit for purpose, whilst the socialist ideals also wanted to move away from industrialisation, but more in terms of its effect on the working class. Both are pretty intertwined, so it's difficult to differentiate the two in a video this short, but I think most people listening will understand that relationship as, or we have had a similar idea over the last 10 to 20 years as the rise of the internet has really come, and we can start to see craftsmen beginning to sell their work to a much wider audience and it becoming an actual argument for people against industrialisation and mass production again. The trouble is that the vast majority of people can only afford mass-produced work, obviously, because the profit margin is so much cheaper. But by increasing the ability for craftsmen to sell to much wider audiences, they've been able to retain enough to make off, but also can offer a higher quality product to more people. So we've kind of seen this happen again, almost 100 years after, because this was around the 1880s that we saw the arts and crafts movement begin. So it is quite interesting how history can repeat itself in different ways, and it'd be interesting to hear where you think these ideas have kind of propagated again. But I would say that we've seen this happen twice now, quite clearly, though we wouldn't call this like the modern arts and crafts movement. So as I mentioned on Art Nouveau again, this all kind of came to a head, this theory, during the Great Exhibition in 1851 actually, where all of the work had this real excessive ornamentation appearance to it and was just one step too far. It was just too much. I mean, there's a nice quote by Owen Jones who said, "In art, novelty without beauty, or beauty without intelligence." And on that same point he said, ornament must be secondary to the thing decorated. And I'd say the point he's trying to make in general was, at the time, you could have, say, a carpet with this perfectly realistic leaf pattern on it that's almost like a photograph. And they said, look, okay, this is unnecessary and it's a distraction at this point. The idea of this is enough. What's important is that this carpet is a flat plane that you find safe to walk on without staring at completely. Whereas when you put this pattern onto it, now you have made this a difficult plane to walk on. What's important is that it's a flat plane to safely walk on. But when you've overly decorated it, people can't walk on it safely. It's made it look like there could be bumps, there could be some people are looking now at the feet to do it. Now, again, you could argue, well, they should be looking at the feet. I've put all this effort into making it look great. You should be staring at these beautiful leaves. But that's not the point of the object, and you're making it an unsafe object now because of the decorative decision that you made. And the artwork shown in that great exhibition was, in general, an extension of that thought. If this is just not right anymore, this is making these objects worthless in multiple senses and we should change it. I don't want to go massively into the social theory that went with it, but it's very hard to differentiate the two because at times the socialist theory and the artistic theory in arts and crafts really depends on the person who's writing the book about it. It can be very complicated. So it's kind of hard to discern very clear ideas in this smaller video about what the arts and crafts movement really was. Because I can't even say that they just hated technology, because quite a few artists, such as William Morris, who owned the Decorative Arts Company, didn't disagree with the use of machines. He just thought that machines should be made in a way that improved the quality. He didn't agree with the lowered quality of it. And how could he run his business without machinery at the time? So he knew that they needed this work, but he didn't agree with the lack of improvement in the quality at the time. I think one of the sad things about arts and crafts movement is that really the values that it held meant that people, just that an average person could imitate it and make themselves versions of these unique pieces of furniture often weren't to a high enough quality as those original artists had hoped. And that kind of devalued the arts and crafts movement at the time in the general public. And it really did lead, I think, to the rise of modernism as time went by, because just the image of it had changed so much over its lifetime. As you can see, the art style itself that I'm drawing inspiration from today is the painted fabric designs that, I mean, I personally would say is the arts and crafts movement. I don't feel knowledgeable enough on furniture to give an idea of a critique on the artwork, so I can't really give anything more than an appreciation towards work I like. With the fabric and the illustration, I can mimic it to an extent and talk about the things that I've learned from it. As I said before, it's this focus on simplified forms of animals and plants, and this focus on natural subject matter in particular that is very important in arts and crafts movement. Again, we see really simple design, we're seeing flat colours without much shading, and it's this beginning again, if you notice, of this outline with a colour fill. And we've seen that develop in Art Nouveau, we've seen that come to place in cloisonné earlier in the week. We're seeing this progression, I think, and I'd like to think that if you didn't know about certain art styles, you're starting to see this art history, you're starting to see where all of these ideas have kind of trickled through people's minds, and how artists have interpreted the previous generation and brought it into their new art style. You know, the Art Nouveau artists grew up looking at arts and crafts. The cloisonnés were looking at Art Nouveau. We can see how all of these have moved on and how each one took that style and brought it into their own generation. And I think it's really interesting to look at how art has developed, especially, I would say, over the last 200 years, when we saw this move from the pre-industrialisation where art could only really be funded by rich private bodies such as rich families or religious funds, and then it moved on to much smaller commissioners such as businesses and companies, and we see the commercial art begin to propagate, and then we begin with the cheapening of materials through the industrialisation revolutions to see artists begin to create art just for themselves. And to see that progression of art in the last 200 years I think is really a beautiful thing to look at, and I really hope that this series, as it continues on and we go through different art movements, especially in those last 200 years, you'll be able to say, oh, I noticed that in this piece it has, say, the bolder outlines and the shaded cell part, and I can see what influenced that artist. Because art does have a visual language, and like any language, the more you learn, the more you can understand, and hopefully then go on to use yourself. On that thought of the past, predicting and moving on to the future, and maybe going forward in the next week, when you create your next piece of art or your next piece of work or whatever you do creatively, to look at it and to begin thinking about all of these great people who came before you, who all created things within their time as reaction to the things that were going on in their day and time and was personal to them, and think about how your artwork also is a reflection of its own time and what you feel that it says about the time, because that's what it's doing. It's giving you a little bit of a reflected observation of what you're seeing. So yeah, I hope that that's something interesting to think about this week. And as always, if you have an idea for a drawing prompt, please leave it below. I'm starting to run a bit low, I think, at this rate. Probably got a month left of drawing requests. So I really would love to hear some ideas if you have them. And I hope you're all doing really well. And I'll see you again next week.